Welcome back to everyone. This is a continuation of the previous video, which was on the languages that the Bible was originally written in. Now, this one is when and how did the Bible get translated into Latin? All right. The Latin Bible developed in several stages. The Old Testament was already translated into Greek. Before Christianity, Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. All right, this is before the time of Christ. This translation became known as the Septuagint, Septuagint, traditionally associated with the 3rd to the 2nd century BC. This is important because the early Christians often used the Greek Septuagint when quoting the Old Testament. Early Christians began translating scripture into Latin. As Christianity spread into the Latin-speaking Western Roman Empire, Christians needed scripture in Latin. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, various portions of the Bible were being translated into Latin. These early translations are collectively called the Old Latin. There wasn't initially yet one official Latin Bible. The most important figure in the Latin Bible's development was Saint Jerome. He lived in the years approximately 347 to 420. And around the year 382, Pope Damasus I asked Jerome to revise the existing Latin translations of the Gospels. Jerome eventually undertook a much larger project, producing a more accurate Latin Bible. Jerome went back to the original languages, and this is one of the most interesting things about Jerome's work. For the Old Testament, Jerome didn't simply translate the Greek Septuagint into Latin. He learned Hebrew and consulted Hebrew manuscripts, attempting to translate from the Hebrew text. For the New Testament, he revised the Latin using the Greek manuscripts that were available to him. His work gradually became known as the Vulgate, Vulgate, from the Latin word vulgata, meaning something like common or widely circulated. Jerome worked on the biblical texts over several decades, beginning in the late 4th century and continuing into the early 5th century. Can you imagine how many years it took him to do this? His translation or revision of the Old Testament was substantially completed about the year 405, although the history of the Vulgate is complicated because not every book in later Vulgate manuscripts was translated by Jerome himself. Over the following centuries, Jerome's work circulated alongside older Latin translations and underwent additional copying and editing. Eventually, the Vulgate became the standard Latin Bible of the Western Church. The Vulgate became so influential that the Council of Trent in 1546 declared the Vulgate the authentic edition of the Bible for use in the Latin Church, particularly in matters of faith and doctrine. However, this didn't mean that Catholics believed the Latin Vulgate was the original language of Scripture. Remember, the original languages were Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. They remained fundamental for biblical scholarship. And then we had, I'd like to outline for you Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek in the Old Testament. The Greek Septuagint beginning several centuries before Christ. The Greek New Testament, of course, was written during the 1st century AD. Old Latin translations were the 2nd to the 4th centuries, and St. Jerome's revisions and translations were the late 4th to the early 5th century. The Latin Vulgate became the principal Bible of Western Christianity, and the Council of Trent in the year 1546 recognized the Vulgate as the authentic edition for the one fascinating point. The word Vulgate, it doesn't mean original Bible. It means common or popular. So that was the common language of the people at the time was the Latin. Jerome's goal was essentially to provide Christians in the Latin-speaking world with a scripture text that they could understand and use, while improving the accuracy of the existing Latin translations. So, in a nutshell, the Bible began primarily in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and it was gradually translated into Latin. St. Jerome's work in the late 4th to early 5th centuries became the foundation of what we know, the Latin Vulgate. And now you know. Okay, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. God bless you. Have a wonderful day.